This is Restless. Okay, well, this is Restless, and I said this is Restless, and then I forgot that I was supposed to bring us in, Matt. So this is my awkward way of bringing us into the show. Welcome back, everyone. Excited to have you. I know that it is got to be around Christmas or after Christmas when we're doing this. If it's for Christmas or the New Year, don't forget, you can get Restless merch. We have a sticker that you can buy. So if you look in the description of the podcast, if you go to our Twitter at Restless Podcasting, 1S on that Restless, then you can find a link and you can go and actually buy a beautiful Restless sticker. I tend to think that everyone in your family, including your grandma, including your great-grandma, everybody that you know would love to have a Restless sticker, whether that be for Christmas or for the New Year, or really any time. This is the beautiful thing about Restless stickers is they are great for any occasion.
Every occasion, any and all occasions.
So I'm Pastor Michael, which is what I'm supposed to say instead of just shilling our sticker. And so I'm Pastor Michael. This is Matt. Matt, you're the host. Why don't you take over? Because this is just getting bad.
We are back again. We are going to continue listening to part of the episode on branding from The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Because in that episode, if you remember, they spent a lot of it talking about the YRR, which we left for this episode this time. We are headed into the clips. We're going to do a free-flowing episode because, again, Mike Cosper is interviewing Colin Hansen, folks we may never get to here on Restless. And so we want to listen to how CT does the YRR, and we will see what we think. So Pastor Michael, should we just take it away?
Let's do it.
And just so everyone knows, as I think people like, it's going to be a lot of stopping and starting, and we'll see how interesting it is.
Turn of the century, at the same time that conversations about the emerging church and postmodernism are starting to gather steam, another movement is brewing. Its roots stretch in several different directions, and into a really strange mix of denominations and personalities. But in spite of their differences, they formed an alliance and made a significant impact on evangelicalism in the 2 decades since.
Okay, one moment as he explains the background of the YRR, which I think he did well. I think it makes me wonder one thing, and I think it kind of doesn't explain one thing as well as if you listen to Ligon Duncan, Albert Mohler, even Colin Hansen in his book. This is a great moment to plug that. As soon as we have 50 reviews, we're going to go through the Young, Restless and Reformed chapter by chapter together. And hopefully that will soon also lead to us having 100 Twitter followers when Pastor Michael will read and review on air Jesus and John Wayne.
So should I say are we doing reviews or rating? We have 58 ratings.
Oh,
so
we may have made it, everybody.
So we maybe have made it. We have to look through it. We have to find out if we're doing ratings or reviews.
So what is interesting is the YRR specifically organized to kind of thwart the influence of postmodernism in the emergent church. That was one of the main motivating factors of all these people coming together, and probably what made Driscoll fit in with them early on was they were there to oppose postmodernism. And it's this idea of, and the thing that it makes me wonder is, I know, again, I think that sometimes this comes out of a desire to be overly neutral. He's like, at the same time, the church was having discussions about postmodernism and the emergent church, another movement was brewing. I think he's trying to be very straight-laced. I think he's trying to be the objective newsman, which I think is, again, we've pointed out the danger of that over and over. But again, it makes it feel like we were having a productive conversation, and then, especially in light of this being all about Driscoll, this came along and interrupted it.
Then here came these guys. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I didn't hear it that way as much, but I don't know. It doesn't seem to me like it was necessarily leaning in that direction. Much more just these are, I mean, even just, talking to Brad Vermurlen, friend of the show, and his kind of take on the rise of the YRR It sounds pretty simple. It sounds like a dumbed down version, right, of what Brad would say.
And again, I think the only thing I would add, and I think Brad would add, is that it was a reaction. It was trying to become the high level of influence over these two other things.
Stem the tide of these within evangelicalism, explicitly so.
And I guess my heart as a true YR guy is I want Mike Cosper to say is, yeah, we got him.
We won.
We won. I want to celebrate.
I want them to say, yeah, this was a good thing, and bring out the champagne. We got him, ladies and gentlemen. That's great.
To understand how it kicked off and got momentum, you should probably talk about some institutions, certainly some churches, and definitely some celebrities. But almost universally, when you talk to folks who've studied the movement, they agree. You have to start by talking about seashells.
Also, I'm going to throw some shade here at Mike Cosper. You didn't interview Brad Vermurlen for this. He certainly deserved to be interviewed.
You need him. I hope they get him before the end of it. Come on. He was there. He studied the church. He wrote a book about it. Oh, come on. Not Colin Hanson. Mike Cosper, you got to get Brad on. And
he is the I will go out of my way to be fair-minded person.
Yeah, right.
But let's listen to about seashells.
A little article here from Reader's Digest.
This is John Piper speaking at Passion's one-day event in 2000. Moments before, he told the story of two women, Ruby and Laura, both in or near their 80s, who'd spent their lives devoted to serving others, and who died while serving as missionaries in Cameroon. Their death wasn't a tragedy, Piper was saying, because they'd given their lives away to something that mattered.
This is a tragedy. Title of the article: Start Now, Retire Early. Bob and Penny took early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years ago when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball, and collect shells.
There's 40,000 people in this.
How dare you? This is John Piper's version of how dare you.
Yeah.
So, Pastor Michael, I think another time it would be a very interesting event for us to review the entirety of the sermon, Don't Waste Your Life.
Yeah, that'd be great. I actually don't know that I've heard this sermon. I heard clips from it, no doubt, at different times. And I did read the book, and it was very impactful. It was a very impactful book for me.
And I think for that reason, and I do think they are right, probably from the help of Vermurlen's research and Colin Hanson's journalism, they know the year 2000, as we've said early on, is very much right at the beginning of this with Passion and these events. And so I'm not going to comment overly on the quality of Don't Waste Your Life. And certainly that would need to be done, again, listening to the entirety of it, which is something we'll put on a list to do. I think when I heard Piper saying this, there are two things that came to my mind. One, Piper's critique of the American comfort seeking, the need for this has, and it's kind of a cliche now to talk about seashells, was right on, right? That was something people were going for. I think over time, I'll say by 10 years later, the message of Don't Waste Your Life, this is why I would be interested in listening to the whole message, became, you are not being faithful for Christ unless you are doing the most quote unquote radical thing you can think of.
Yeah. It has to be missions. It has to be ministry or something like that.
The comparison, right, of these yuppie people in Punta Gorda, Florida, and these women who died in Cambodia, right? I think you could retire to faithfully spend time with your grandchildren and church.
Yeah. Like, and dare I say, far more of the time, a faithful retirement would look like, I'm going to devote myself to my kids and grandkids and church and just whatever they need.
Right.
And rather than I'm going to leave my family that I have to do missions, which sometimes is no noble and great. I'm not,
Yes.
Don't hear me.
Yes.
Don't hear me saying missions is not a good thing. God bless everybody that God calls to missions. I support them.
Yep.
I literally support them. Like, I
Yep.
mean, I'm all for it. The idea that in order to be the radical, quote unquote, Christian means you have to be the missionary is extremely flawed, and it has caused great damage.
Yes.
That kind of pietism that does show up a lot from someone like John Piper has been extremely damaging for the long-term generational faithfulness of the church.
Yes. This is what I'm saying is that, and this is why it'd be interesting to listen
we got
to
to do it. All right, we got it. So it's on the schedule, everybody. We don't know when, but we're going to review this.
Because we also want to do an episode where we talk about the benefit of gaining practical skills of like building these kinds of things that I think the quote unquote radical Christianity moment, they would throw those over the bus. The appropriate critique Piper is making, and maybe it's the point of the talk, and if so, it's a great point, is it's the self-focused nature of how most people structure their careers in retirement. That's problematic.
Yeah, and
that is a waste.
Just as a generation, baby boomers like John Piper, right? So he's talking about people that are like, I mean, these are his people, right? Like his generation were doing this. That'd be pretty brutal. Like, knowing that like the majority of my generation is like they lived in an extraordinary time, became very wealthy overall, and they have squandered it for not just the kingdom of God, for like just generally speaking. But the fact that he cues into that spiritual side of things, that they like, hey, there's this entire like spiritual, these institutions and resources and all of this just like amazing wealth that has been built up over centuries, and we're going to suck it dry for everything it's worth.
Right. Like
he really hits home on that, and it's true. Like it is true that there was a generation, and others do it too. It's not just the boomers. It just happens to be particularly true of a lot of boomers as a generation.
It's just, we'll say it is no surprise Piper would be the one identifying this
and seeing it
as a Christian pastor. I think maybe after we listen to Don't Waste Your Life, it would be great for us to do a restless version of it, because I think the temptation to have this kind of retirement is actually gone for our generation, because it's never going to happen. Like, that's not achievable for us. Like, it's gone, baby. And so it would be interesting for us to try and update that, but let's keep listening.
This crowd that's gathered outside Memphis, and they're sitting on tarps and garbage bags, wearing raincoats, ponchos. It's maybe 70 degrees, but it's rainy and windy, just miserable to be out. And it's not an environment any preacher ever wants to have to show up in. But even going back, watching the video on YouTube, there's something kind of electric about it.
That's a tragedy. That's a tragedy. And there are people in this country that are spending billions of dollars to get you to buy it. And I get 40 minutes to plead with you, don't buy it. With all my heart, I plead with you, don't buy that dream. The American dream. A nice house, a nice car, a nice job, a nice family, a nice retirement, collecting shells. As the last chapter, before you stand before the Creator of the universe to give an account with what you did. Here it is, Lord, my shell collection. Well, not for Ruby and not for Laura. Don't waste your life. Don't waste it.
Pastor John is an electric speaker.
He really is.
Doubt.
I like, even just hearing him again, I'm like, oh yeah, man, I do miss the days of listening to a lot of Piper sermons. He's good. He's a great speaker.
I'll just say this, that, I'm not too worried about the nice car, nice retirement house, because I'm planning on owning nothing and being happy. That's my future.
Oh man, you'll be fine inside of your pod. No, I want to say, like, one of the things that I love about John Piper, and that I want to say here, is that like he seems to be one of these guys that actually, like, he puts his money where his mouth is. You see the kind of like like amount of like money that he has given away, the amount of money that he like had as a salary over time when he was pastoring was very, like, for the size of Bethlehem Baptist and all that he did, he lived like a very humble life. He gave away, so, like, you think about the amount of books, like unbelievable amounts of money that this guy could have been making, and he gave almost all of it to, you know, desiring God and to missions. Like they've given so much away. He's done so much with that, and like giving his time and energy, you know, even in his retired years, to a lot of ministry. That it really is incredible. You know, it really is. I'm very impressed by that.
On it historically has this sort of spark moment, and it can be easily overplayed in the future, just for the sake of historical narratives. But if you're looking for one of that moment within the Young, Restless, Reformed, it would be John Piper's one day message, "Don't waste your life," in 2000. For people in my generation, so essentially older millennials into Gen X, it's one of those things where I don't know how many of us were actually there and how many more of us claim that we were there in retrospect, or just that we were there in spirit. It's like the Woodstock of Young, Restless, Reformed.
This is Colin Hansen.
I just love,
so weird.
I love calling it the Woodstock. It's a very YRR or very evangelical thing that it's this, like, we overestimate how big of a deal these things probably were, right? Like when we went back and looked at the list of the 10 ideas changing the world in 2009, when it made the list, and we never heard of anything else other than New Calvinism. But yeah, it is.
It's just interesting too that it is like, what would you compare this to?
Right.
It's not, you don't call it like a revival. You don't call it like, wow, this is like the first Great Awakening or even the second Great Awakening. It's like, this is like Woodstock.
Right. Yeah. It's just, it is interesting. And again, right, I think that, you know, Colin Hansen mentions, right, that it was this challenge to love Christ above all things, which is, you know, again, it was a good thing.
Colin is the vice president for content and editor-in-chief of the Gospel Coalition. And in the mid-2000s, he wrote a book called Young, Restless, Reformed, about the new Calvinist movement that was taking off at the time. He, like many others, points to this moment in Memphis as a critical launching pad for the movement.
It's in an open field. It's tons of music. The weather is kind of crazy. And there's this wild-haired guy calling a generation to lay down their lives for the sake of Christ and the gospel.
As Hansen traces it out, the discovery of John Piper gave people a taste of Reformed theology that for many resonated on a different level than what they'd known in church before.
What I came to understand under the reading of Charles Taylor and other, you know, describers of our secular age is that Christianity without much of a historical, theological, confessional orientation is very difficult to sustain within an immanent frame. So a transcendent religion that is connected biblically across the Old and New Testament, that is connected historically within a robust confessional tradition, that offers you a genuine alternative to the sort of therapeutic turn, I would say, the me-centered turn in American culture and including evangelical theology. Reformed theology gives you a really strong place to stand in response to all of that. So
fascinating. So everything he just said about what was brought forward is what we have often said was not existent within the YRR.
Right, exactly. Charles Taylor is one of those guys that everyone loves to talk about, and I'm not convinced most people are smart enough to read or actually understand. But you're right. When he says the need of a confessional, broad theology for our secular time, in my mind, I thought is exactly what the YRR didn't deliver.
Yeah.
And if he's right, which again, we're quoting a kind of a secular philosophical thinker on these things, on secularism. And if he's right, maybe that explains where the YRR went. That people did seek confessionalism, and that in that way the movement couldn't really hold together.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It is, I mean, maybe one thing to say in its credit is that it did introduce a lot of us to a theology that at least had the opportunity, or it did lend itself for some to that actual like transcendent view of the way that the world is, how God has made it, who he is. That, so maybe like there was an aspect of transcendence to it that did not exist in a lot of American evangelicalism apart from that. And so maybe there is an element where that is definitely the case. And maybe that's more what he's saying too, not that it was in itself confessional, although we've heard a lot of YRR guys think of themselves as, confessional because they hold to the 5 points, of Calvinism.
Which are a summary of a confessional document that they have almost certainly never read or I didn't read when I would describe myself that way.
Yes, exactly.
If those are concerns that you grew up with, let's say that you grew up in a kind of theologically thin evangelical background, the Reformed theology was a pretty appealing coming of age theology.
Colin's argument makes a lot of sense to me. If young people at the turn of the millennium were looking for a gateway into something that feels like transcendence, something they're out of touch with because of life in a disenchanted, secularized world, then Reformed theology has an especially strong appeal.
Amen, by the way.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, let's clip that and make sure that that's kind of the central brand of this podcast.
It immerses them in a story about God's mysterious providence, and it gives them a sense of place in a larger narrative. And whatever one might think of Reformed theology, there's no denying the fact that Piper has a way, particularly through his preaching, of presenting his listeners with a vision of a big, transcendent, and awe-inspiring God. The whole point of his passion message is summed up in a line that he almost whispered, "Don't waste your life." And that became the theme of his ministry in the years to come, inspiring countless to become pastors, church planners, and missionaries. As Hansen frames it then, Piper's sermon at Passion was a moment where Reformed theology hit the mainstream, and it did so at a moment when other efforts had already laid groundwork to be able to support, sustain, and extend the interest.
Also worth noting, Piper, not confessionally Reformed, famously so.
Right, yeah, explicitly so.
Yeah, famously wrong about some key Reformed categories.
Yeah.
So he points to Ligon Duncan, Reformed Theological Seminary, and Reformed University Fellowship in one stream. There's also Albert Mohler and the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in another, a seminary that Mohler had essentially stripped to the studs and rebuilt over the past decade after the conservative resurgence in the SBC. There's also Driscoll and Mars Hill, and there's C.J. Mahaney and Sovereign Grace Ministries. Mahaney is a
Listening to that list, I just think to myself of the meme of the little dog in the fiery room. This is fine. All of those things have turned out really well. This list of the YRR movements.
No, yeah, that's really interesting to say. But even listening to it, I do think like there is like a part of me that is like being transported back again to where I was like, wow, like it was amazing in a lot of ways, right? I mean, that this like all of a sudden took off in the way that it did, as like broadly as it did. That Calvinism was able to like basically make the play within the American church that it did is incredible. And I'm grateful for it. I do see the hand of God in it. And like even where it's fallen apart, like, who knows, even still is what I would say, what God is doing through that. Right. So like, I mean, we're literally making this podcast because of this.
Right.
What is there that's going to, come of this long term?
What will come of this podcast?
Or this podcast.
I think
hopefully good. Hopefully not the all of this is fine meme.
I think that will be what is actually interesting about reading Colin Hansen's book, which is, as we mentioned in our celebrity culture episode, is organized around these kind of key figures. I think it will be enjoyable to kind of transport ourselves back at what was going on and look at it with hindsight, which I think will be enjoyable for us.
Described former druggie who came to faith in the charismatic revivals of the 70s. He co-planted what became Covenant Life Church in Gaithersburg, Maryland, with Larry Tomczak in 1977. And then they launched a network of churches with another co-founder, Brent Detweiler, in 1982. They were originally called People of Destiny International, but in the 1990s, after they came to embrace Reformed doctrine, they rebranded.
A name. that just like sounds so much like a cult, like, hey, we want to brand ourselves the most cult like that we can.
People of Destiny Church.
People of Destiny.
As Sovereign Grace. It bears
a little bit better.
Oh, that was a solid move. Brand. Well, let's just talk about the brand of it. That is a solid move.
Let's put it this way. You wouldn't be singing Sovereign Grace songs every Sunday like we know you are, Acts 29, if it was still called People of Destiny.
People of Destiny.
Music.
Hey, where'd you get this music? Oh, the People of Destiny.
Yeah. Yeah, he kind of took a turn from the charismatic brand there.
There's mentioning that Sovereign Grace has faced a series of scandals, most of which were made public starting in 2009 with the departure of Detweiler. But as the new Calvinist movement was taking off in the decade prior, and when Hansen was writing his book, most of this was out of view. Connected to Mahaney was one other figure, a celebrity in his own right whose commitment to Reformed doctrine also helped popularize it.
Wait, who is this person? Their commitment to the Reformed doctrine?
I was convicted by his teaching about the local church and ended up getting to know him and then moving across the country to be an intern in his church, live in his basement, learn from him. He said to me, "You're a Timothy, you need a Paul in your life."
This is Joshua Harris. Harris is the author of I Kiss Dating Goodbye.
I'll just note this, that especially in light of all the people we're interviewing, the person we're now interviewing as the committed,
the guy who really got the Reform side of things. Interesting. Yeah.
Just at least give that to Colin Hansen.
Yeah.
He's well, I know TGC isn't the YRR. That was T4G, but I would rather, if I have to pick someone of all the people that have been being interviewed in this, I'll take Colin Hansen.
And basically up to this point, everything he said was great, right?
Yeah.
Hey, we really wanted a transcendent theology that, was really confessional and historic and all of this kind of stuff. Oh yeah, that's great. And then it's no, we're going to go with Harris.
Yep. Because, and it's also, it's even worse than I thought, because Harris what was he actually most known for as a Christian? He wasn't known for his YRR cred. He was known for I Kiss Dating Goodbye.
Guy. Yeah, he was the purity culture guy.
Yes. So it is the guy. He is the epitome of the thing we beat up now as a straw man.
Yeah, that we hate the most, right?
Of the bad moralism.
And he's the guy.
He's the guy. And again, when we listen to his interview, maybe we'll do an episode on it if it's good. Otherwise, I think eventually we will, if it's not done in that episode, it might be exhaustively, is his letter that he released when he announced he was leaving the faith, because it is an interesting and really strange letter. But I do think that it is this guy who I actually think rejected a lot of his moralism he was known for. And I think sadly with it went Christianity. But this is one of those moments where it's I refuse to be repped by this dude.
A book that became the go-to guide for dating and courtship among a certain tribe of conservative evangelicals when it came out in 1997. His parents.
Pastor Michael, did you read that book, by the way?
No, I never
didn't
either. I got rid of a copy recently. I picked a copy up somewhere at a thrift store over the years, and I found a copy, and I'm pretty sure it got thrown away. I maybe should have kept it. All the books, by the way, that I end up throwing away are books that it's well, someday we'll end up doing it on the podcast. I'm great. Now I have to buy a book that I had a cheap copy of. But no, I never read it. And honestly, I don't remember it ever being talked about. I don't remember in the circles that I was in, this was not a big book.
Yeah. And I think it was mostly pre-YRR. It was 90s, very 90s.
Yeah. It is a very 90s kind of a thing. It really does seem that way.
It's a very 90s persona.
It is. It totally is.
Were significant figures in the homeschooling movement. And Harris had established a platform in that world, speaking and publishing a magazine called New Attitude. But his ambitions changed after he met Mahaney.
I just saw in him a model for what I wanted to be. And I was, very excited about laying down my parachurch goals and embracing the importance of the local church, and that redirected my entire life.
He started his internship at the church the same year his book released. That was 1997. In 2004, he became the lead pastor at Covenant Life, and he served in that role until 2015. He left in the fallout of the controversies mentioned earlier, initially pursuing a seminary education. Then in 2019, he shared that he no longer identifies as a Christian. I wanted to talk to Harris, though, because he's another young leader in this movement, someone who was in the room for much of what came later, and in ways not unlike Mark, he's a casualty of the Christian celebrity phenomenon.
So Cosper knows that there are people like us. Maybe he knows the Restless podcast. He knows there are people that are going to give him flack for this.
He's a secret listener. We know it. We've talked about it. He's a secret listener.
He knows there are people who are going to give him flack for this interview. It's not that you're interviewing him. It's that how he's being presented is what we're criticizing.
Right. Yeah.
It's not just you're interviewing all these people who were involved. It's being that he is providing an insightful take.
Yep. So he's
on what was
one
really
of the primary
happening.
authorities. And he also is described as like purely a victim, right? It's not his fault that all of these things happen that we literally talk about all the time being so problematic, like purity culture and like the YRR. No, he's a victim of it all. Whereas what is Driscoll? So seriously, we need to talk about that. Like, how come this guy is considered a victim of all this when he was almost as much? So maybe he wasn't as popular as Driscoll, but he was just as much a perpetrator of this stuff. And if he could have had the 60-person media team that Driscoll had, would he have been in the same place? Almost definitely, you know, like almost definitely from everything that we've seen. And
debatably, the only thing that held him back was an older man mentoring
him and saying, hey, don't do that. One who also is now out of grace, has fallen from grace in this movement. And so it's just such a mess to have this as like the guy, and we're going to talk to him. I don't mind you talking to him and being like, hey, what is your view of things? But to make him like such a like important voice in this matter is nuts.
The amount of time he's going to get in this episode, I don't know how the episode what's all about him is structured. And again, I'm sure they they really want to be taken as they're really, really fair. I think that
I don't think it's only that. I actually think that one of the reasons that Cosper includes him in here as much as he does in the way that he does is I actually think, and this comes out more when there is the interview, so a little bit of spoiler for you because you haven't listened to it. But he basically ends by saying, hey, like I can't help but feeling that Jesus isn't done with you. Like he is clearly trying to witness to this guy through this. And so he includes and this is it's a very like evangelical Christianity today thing to do, right?
Yep.
Like I'm going to witness to him by making sure that he knows that he's the most important thing, or like he's center, or like I'm going to listen to him, like I want to validate his experience or something like that. And God bless Mike Cosper. Like it is clear, like he wants this guy to know Jesus again. And so that's great. Like he does want to do that. It does seem, I think that's actually why I don't think it's as much for Cosper anyway. I don't think it's probably as much like this guy's voice is really meaningful here as much as the personal connection I have to this man.
Sure.
And I want to like find a way to reach him and people like him.
And this guy likes the platform stuff.
And
I think that I'm going to, again, because of Joshua Harris's state as someone who has committed the sin of apostasy and wants to help other people deconstruct their faith.
Yeah.
That's why he's getting the treatment he is from us. I will say on the other side, whether this is the right way to go about it or not. Again, we're in the tech age. So, if the anything goes state, God bless Mike Cosper. This is one of the things that is a true tragedy of what's going on is all of these scandals and all of these things that do play a part in people like this walking away from their faith. People go into seminaries to get answers, and instead they get long discussions on how trustworthy the gospels are, right? That these things do that. This is in that way a tragedy.
Also, by his telling, he played an unwitting role in an introduction that would give birth to one of the movement's strange alliances.
So there's this joke. It's kind of a funny story that Mark Dever tells, that he met CJ because he was looking for a copy of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, and they were driving by the church. He didn't know CJ, and he's like, "Oh, let's stop in the church. That's where Josh works." And he found a copy of the book and walked by CJ's office and left a note. And that's how CJ and Mark Dever, who would then later go on to start Together for the Gospel and do all kinds of things, kind of connected. So I love to give CJ a hard time that he owed his friendship to Mark to me, which he vehemently denied. He'll deny till his dying breath, I'm sure.
In many ways,
That's a fun story.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mark Dever and C.J. Mahaney couldn't be more different. Mahaney's ex-hippie, low church, and lighthearted demeanor is a stark contrast to the Cambridge-educated pastor of a historic Baptist church on Capitol Hill. But
People of Destiny. Capitol Hill Baptist
Capitol Hill
Church.
Baptist, people of destiny.
You're friends now. You're the friendships that built T4G.
they became fast friends, and that friendship birthed one of the significant landmarks of the new Calvinist movement.
I started running this conference that was kind of the continuation of my events that I'd been doing called New Attitude. And the New Attitude conference was for young adults and singles, college-age students. It was sort of, we went to Passion to kind of learn from them. I remember meeting with Louie and basically saying, like, I want to do this too. And so that was a place where we actually started having that in Louisville, which was part of the way that CJ through Mark Dever connected with Al Mohler and then Lig Duncan. And so I remember being at the New Attitude, one of our first, I don't know, second or third New Attitude conferences, and CJ calling me in my hotel late at night and talking about how he'd been with those three guys, and they started brainstorming about this idea of doing their own event that was built around their friendships. And so it's like seeing, Together for the Gospel birthed in that context. There's just such a sense of energy. I mean, evangelicals just love movements, right? We just get so jazzed about these kinds of things.
Together for the Gospel would launch in 2006.
He's not wrong. Oh, man.
Right.
What, another conference? Great.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds awesome. That is wow. Like that is the
and him starting conferences and kind of building these kinds of platforms, totally different than Driscoll building a platform.
right. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Not even comparable.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure it didn't take any get our media team, get the internet buzz going and use social media this way or whatever. It is interesting how they're just playing these things so different. And it's telling, right?
It's in this, and this may, I don't know. I think that there is a concern because I do think for most people, probably not me because of how my personality is, I think Joshua Harris comes across much more likable than Driscoll does. Certainly in this podcast where we're playing the
that's interesting.
Meme man clips.
You and I, we like Driscoll for the same reason.
Exactly.
Right? Like especially young us was very much attracted to that brash, bold, and the I'm gonna be the more softer spoken, reasonable, and kind of pietistic side of things was I don't want any more of that. That's how I felt.
And throughout church history, right, there are excellent godly examples of more soft-spoken men,
different temperaments.
Exactly.
Sure.
This temperamental thing, right? I think John Piper is a much more even though he comes strongly as a speaker, he's a much kind of softer, more temperamental man, right? I mean, we can look into the Reformation of the more, we might say Martin Dutzer is the kind of you don't have all the writing of all the bombastic things he did because he was busy marrying people and being
just pastoring.
And then you have guys like John Knox, who's I'm going to carry a sword and I'm going to say, we're taking Scotland or I die, right? These are different temperaments.
Yeah.
But what drives me so crazy is that bringing it back to tone, don't criticize us for tone, because what drives me crazy is the world we live in now where the temperament is real. And that's probably a postmodern thing, that the temperament is really all that matters because the truth claims and all the other things about it are actually not valuable or to the secular world actually real. So the only thing we can judge you on is your presentation and your temperament. And so I think that the different temperaments in many ways, if anything, there's probably Christianity today might be accurately picking up on we need to change the temperament we have if we want to keep reaching people, as you're talking about, as there's probably a concern for these certain people.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
At the Galt House Hotel in Louisville. That first year was small, maybe 600 people. But as Hansen points out, the togetherness of that event is what made it so significant.
So you had 2 Southern Baptists, a charismatic, non-denominational person, and then you also had a Presbyterian, PCA, who were leading this thing as friends and bringing in different speakers. And that was one of the first public demonstrations in 2006 in Louisville at Together for the Gospel of what was becoming this broader phenomenon that I would then dub Young Restless Reformed.
Other speakers would include John Piper, John MacArthur, and R.C. Sproul. And when you throw them all in the mix, you find a group of men who don't have consensus on baptism, the Lord's Supper, church governance, charismatic gifts, or whether or not someone can be an apostle today.
Wow.
Let's not sweat the small stuff for the sake of togetherness.
Oh, man.
Here's one that's not small. Here's one that, like, if he's talking about C.J. Mahaney in this case, whether or not someone can be an apostle today, big deal.
Yeah, that is a big
deal.
Wow.
Like that's not a small deal. But again, I think this is what they're saying. They're just not saying it clearly. Again, I'm just like, let's go to Driscoll's branding. Clarity over creativity. Just say what worked about this is it brought in people from a wide range of theological perspectives, right?
Also, is what Driscoll did simply just the like he literally is just willing to say, this is what we're doing. Like, we're willing to actually just say, yeah, we have a giant media team and I'm #1 on iTunes. And it's probably because I'm a much funnier and better preacher than you. Like, he just said that stuff, right? Like, it was all up front. It was obvious.
Right.
Like, even the concerns that people had. And in the end, the things that made Mars Hill implode, there were guys like John MacArthur again, who are literally calling it out from the beginning. They see it from the very beginning. So it was always there.
Right.
But the difference between that and these other kind of like conference circuits and let's like make a big name for ourselves and like, you know, let's draw a big crowd and sell a bunch of books. Somehow that's like fine because they say they're together for the gospel. They don't say, wow, I'm really good at this.
Right.
So they don't like say it up front. And not to say that like some of those guys, I'm not saying that all of them were like, maybe as arrogant or something, but like there is this element of, yeah, this is what we're doing. We're making a crazy amount of money by doing this.
We can do all the big names together for the gospel. Driscoll's like, I'm going to do #1 on iTunes. And I believe Driscoll would have said for the gospel, right?
Yeah, right.
And this is why Carl Trueman criticized them for this.
And all of it. That's why, like, you love a guy like Carl Trueman or others who are like they were just consistent. They were consistent the whole time and consistent in, I'm going to criticize this and even be willing to like tell these people to their face my problem with what it is that they're doing. Like that takes like serious courage. Knowing that you will never be invited back to this conference because of this. Like you're not doing the, hey, we need the jet fuel of this guy. We need to be a part of this. We need to like use his fame for the gospel. You're saying, well, I'm not going to hitch myself to anything that seems like it's really problematic and untrue, even if it seems like there's like a pragmatic element that I could get out of it. It's not worth it, you know? And God bless Carl Trueman.
Right. I think the question is all of this is based off the idea of bigness and celebrity for the sake of the gospel. And sometimes it ends really badly and sometimes it ends well. And so there's a lot that can be discussed in it, but there are some similarities.
It was like the idea that these things are so different, that the whole Mars Hill movement was different than a lot of these other churches and denominations and like, you know, Peoples of Destiny and conferences and all of this. Like, it's not that different. You know, these things are actually unbelievably similar. Now, once you start getting into some of the like things from Together for the Gospel, sure, like there are significant differences in how these people approach things, but still, like the big conference aspect of it, not that different. It really is not that different.
And yet here they are, sharing a stage. It demonstrates how powerfully theological commitments on certain issues can build bridges. And while concerns from people like John MacArthur would mean that Driscoll would never be a part of Together for the Gospel, an alliance that formed at about the same time would welcome him in, the Gospel Coalition.
I remember.
There you go. Hat tip, John MacArthur.
Yeah, he did it. He kept him out. He knew.
Covering the first Gospel Coalition public meeting in 2007 for Christianity Today. And I remember a clean-cut, fresh-faced Mark Driscoll, like I said, 2007, with his polo shirt, meekly standing in line, waiting with all these other people, there are maybe 500, 700 people at this conference, waiting to ask a question of these pastors, John Piper, Don Carson, and Tim Keller. And we have pictures of that as well. And so Mark seemed around that time as the kind of person who was interested in learning, interested in growing. That didn't last very long.
This was about the same time that Hansen would profile Driscoll for Christianity Today.
This is something they bring up. And in the context of this episode of brand building, they're kind of describing Driscoll as he's only there for the brand, the opportunities, or what he can build. And I said this to Pastor Michael while we weren't recording, that I actually think Driscoll was there to learn. And now they're going to describe later in this podcast, I don't know if we'll play the clip of him saying, well, I can't submit to someone with a smaller church. I think, and they also talk about, why does Driscoll suddenly become reformed? I literally think Driscoll came to kind of these events, or his relationships with these kinds of men. I think Driscoll was learning Reformed theology from them.
Yeah.
And I think his realization early in his life that the emergent church was jettisoning things he saw quite obviously in the Bible, and found these kinds of men teaching Reformed theology. I think he was there to learn that. I also, probably the point they make that is probably legitimate, is that he was not there to learn leadership skills. He probably figured, right, that's kind of his wheelhouse, right? He's doing those things, quote unquote, better than all of these people.
Yeah, what he needed was a theology. That's interesting. Also, it's just interesting, again, where there's this whole Christianity Today podcast about like how horrible this guy was. And you have an interview with a guy who profiled him at the time, early on, for your magazine. Like you were doing this, right? Like you were doing you Christianity Today, and probably are still doing this. Let's hitch ourselves to this, because it will gain us some kind of celebrity too.
And I'm sure I think sometimes when we look back on these kinds of things, and this would be a risk for you and I, it's a much bigger risk for well-funded things like Christianity Today or TGC. Well, the fact that we're looking back with criticism on these things means we're not at risk for this now.
Right.
Which, no, please, TGC. See, you might be at risk of hitching yourself to a movement headed for collapse.
Yes.
Right now. There's a chance you've hitched yourself to something that is going to collapse.
Man. Just, learn from your past mistakes.
Social justice. I'm sorry. We'll keep playing the clips.
In an article titled Pastor Provocateur. It's a pretty interesting read, given all that's unfolded since, because a lot of the concerns were already there. But like so many who encountered him at the time, it was easy to let the weight of his successes overwhelm the visible concerns.
I took a lot of criticism from people like John MacArthur for writing about Driscoll. The Gospel Coalition took a lot of criticism for including people like Driscoll. And it would be interesting to go back in retrospect and consider what were all of the different warning signs that we missed, that I missed. And I think that's pretty obvious in some ways.
Again, all this is happening around.
Maybe go ahead and share those things. I thought that's what this was all about.
Yeah.
But
fortunately, there's a podcast that literally exists to go back
and discuss what did we miss
that you are being interviewed on.
And it's just, man, that statement, that drives me nuts a little bit, right? That, it would be great to go back and see what we missed, but it's obvious. Oh, really? Like, okay, well then why don't you just share it? Just tell us then. What do you do you have regrets? Right? Do you have regrets in this situation?
We know John Piper doesn't.
Right. Maybe John Piper doesn't, but does TGC have regrets that they did this? And just the fact that it's passed over so like glibly and like, oh, well, like we're just passing that up. That just shows me like there's something going on here that like you hitched yourself to this wagon. You like became popular in part because of this. Like you rode this with this guy, and you do hold some responsibility for it, but you are refusing to actually look yourself in the mirror and recognize that that's the case.
Pastor Michael, in closing, I would like to say something that I think all of our listeners, as am I, I'm very thankful the Restless podcast exists, because I actually think this description of the YRR, again, I know they had to do it in about 5 minutes, but when I think Colin Hansen, a great person to interview for this, and then the other person is Joshua Harris, I don't think we got a real, feel of the YRR. And I think that divorcing Driscoll from that movement is actually a way to pretty misunderstand what was going on. And so I'm here to say, don't worry, everybody. We here at Restless, we are going to keep going. We are going to walk through the young, restless, and reformed in a way that Christianity Today either didn't have time or didn't care to.
We don't just talk about the rise and fall of Mars Hill. We don't just talk about the rise and fall of Mars Hill, the podcast.
Yep.
We also talk about the rise and fall of the entirety of the young, restless, and reformed movement.
And Colin Hansen, if you would like to come with us and have that interesting conversation,
we really would love it.
We'll be nice. It's Winsome Winter. We will be nice.
This is the time to come. You don't want to come during the summer.
All right. Thank you for listening to Restless as we cover some more Christianity Today stuff. Pastor Michael, I'm worried we may not have been as winsome as we needed to be.
I don't know. We tried. Listen, we're trying, people. I know that that's hard to believe. We came to like our deeper convictions in part under a guy like Mark Driscoll. So give us a break.
Give us a break. That's our temperament. Rate and review this show. Send us to #1 on iTunes.